What's going on, Cover Killer Nation? All That Remains. A band that still has a very dedicated following, but it's one that has certainly been split in the past decade, leading up to their new album here in 2018, Victims of the New Disease. It's been based around mostly inconsistent offerings as far as the music has been concerned, as well as Phil Labonte's speech about how his band has transcended metal. It certainly didn't help. But whenever we heard the first singles off of Victim of the New Disease, there was actually a lot of hope that was going around. Perhaps they'd finally found that balance between the two parts of their career that has made for a better album, or at least a more consistent offering. Either that, or maybe they had finally gone full tilt boogie back to the metalcore that brought them to the dance 15 plus years ago. But before the album could even drop, we had the tragedy of Ollie passing away. We had the mourning that came with that, and now the information being gathered that could potentially have treacherous results. Yikes. There's a lot going on here, so the album dropping will hopefully cauterize the wound a little bit. Now, Fuck Love, the very first offering on this disc, is not even 3 minutes, but it's one that certainly shows a side of All That Remains that has showed up before, but it's uber aggressive. It's a heavy as hell metalcore song that's near its short end time actually descends even further, having a little bit of a breakdown characteristic and maybe going as far as deathcore is concerned. Phil's, filthy vocals here are just absolutely pristine, not to mention the range being showed we knew he possessed, but there was a certain snarl behind this that definitely felt like it had a lot more oomph behind it. It was being really projected in an over-the-top way, but one that certainly seemed to reflect the track. Everything's Wrong is kind of a different side of that coin. It's still metalcore, and the clean voice starts to come out to play for Phil, and that is also sounding really good. So right now, right out of the gate, from a vocal standpoint, everything sounds really good, really great, and the compositions are pretty decent as well. This is so far a really smooth listen, just 2 tracks in. Now, whenever you go even further down this album into a track such as Wasteland, then you're getting the full throwback. Has this band gone all in? Not really, because Blood I Spill is not necessarily, it's kind of just a middling track, but Wasteland feels like it's a forgotten Killswitch Engage song. This is one that definitely would have fit in during the mid-2000s metalcore boom, and it's one that would have probably gotten a great reaction at shows. This track has just that great vocal harmony, or at least vocal rhythm, during its chorus that gives you that feeling of old mid-2000s Killswitch. And whenever it comes to the verses and everything else that you get with it, it has that metalcore charm that charmed so many people and caused metalcore to be a big deal during that era of our lives. And Wasteland really stands as perhaps one of the better tracks that All That Remains have produced in the past 10 years or so, even if it is more so a throwback than a true step forward. But then Alone in the Darkness hits, the 5th track on this album, and it feels like they raided Jerry Cantrell's bag and were able to steal one of his riff ideas. And honestly, whenever you hear those words, you think I'm going to bash it. I'm not. This is well done. That soft, that soft strum guitar that eventually does get a little bit of electric property, the sort of, chilled out pacing by comparison to some of the, ridiculousness that you've heard on the first 4 songs is a nice change of pace. This is something that All That Remains has been doing throughout the past couple of albums of their career, but they never really felt like they hit it as well as they did with Alone in the Darkness. It's one that feels a little bit more consistent, and again, like I said, if you went into Jerry Cantrell's solo career, this song feels like it would be extremely complimentary. It's done by a completely different band. I like this track. Too bad the remaining part of the album kind of dies a little bit, and again, that's where some of the problems do come in. One of the big problems with metalcore is that it can become overly predictable, and the way in which you're able to quell that is by having your overall composition be so strong that you forget the fact that you're listening to essentially the same or similar thing over and over again. It's the reason why the great metalcore albums of the 2000s had a certain freshness to them. One part was because they certainly were still fresh, considering the sound was still evolving and hadn't really reached its peak. It was still in its infancy, or at least its early adolescence. But whenever you get to this point in the career, it's kind of all been done, so what do you do? And songs such as Misery and Me and Broken kind of feel like it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel. Instead, it's just keeping the wheel spinning. They're not necessarily all that bad, but they're not very memorable. But then Just Tell Me Something comes along, which features Danny Worsnop from Asking Alexandria, lending his vocal talents side by side with Phil's. And this actually creates a fairly interesting environment. And it's a slower song, so not so much like Alone in the Darkness, but it feels like a hard rock ballad. We've reached that territory. If this was a song that was released in the mid to late 2000s, complimentary to bands such as Shinedown that were releasing songs such as 45, this one would be all over the radio and would be extremely big. In fact, it still sounds like it's a radio single that has the potential to catch a little bit of fire and be the track that some people listen to whenever they maybe have a big decision that they have to make, or just getting over the results of a big decision sort of being placed upon them by somebody that they care about. It's that kind of song. It carries that kind of somber mood and tone. I meant when I said, and then the title track, Victim of the New Disease, unfortunately suffer from similar fates such as Misery and Me and Broken. Although with Victim of a New Disease, it hurts a little bit more considering it's also the final track on the album. Nothing very memorable here, nothing that's going to leave you instantaneously feeling like you listened to maybe not necessarily a classic, but an excellent album. It's one that feels like that there is a more of the same problem, but not really as great of one. Instead, there's a nice variety and maturity to this disc that shows that All That Remains is heading in the right direction. And hopefully, if the writing process is able to continue, they'll be able to find a lot more balance and equilibrium. But then that brings us to the major problem, and that's the fact that this is a band that faces a really unknown future. Ollie and the band were, representative of the musical side, whereas Phil was writing all the lyricism, which is kind of an odd paradigm considering what some of these songs seem to be about. There's a lot of talk about relationships. There's a lot of talk about either love or a lot of talk about how, life is somewhat crippling. Given what's actually happening right now and swirled in controversy based around the death of Ollie Sykes, it almost feels prophetic or strange. It definitely also potentially suggests that Phil was writing a bit about his friend, and doing so perhaps from the light of somebody who was worried or on his side. There's definitely some haunting interior moments to this disc since it was released after Ollie's death, and considering, of course, once again, the controversy that swirls around it. So this album does have a strange sort of aura that surrounds it. And does that, as a result, make it a terrific disc? Does that alter the way in which we sort of peer into it? Does it hurt a little bit more that somebody maybe isn't saying that this is the greatest thing that they've done in, 5 years or in their career? Basically taking part of that whole, well, Ollie's dead, we should probably be respectful of his work. It might hurt a little bit, but you still have to be, honest about things, as opposed to just taking the high road based around, something that's happened. Hopefully we do find some answers whenever it comes to Ollie's death, and if it does happen to be one of treachery, hopefully justice is served. As for the album's a pretty good one. It's one that isn't necessarily going to signal the return of All That Remains to the glory that they had in the middle part of the 2000s. This isn't the Fall of Ideals Part 2, and it never was really intended to be. Instead, they're straddling that mix between the two sounds that they have within their catalog, and it's helping them actually hone those tracks a little bit better. The fact that we do have some subtle callbacks to the 2000s material while also pushing forward and seemingly modifying what they currently had is definitely a sign that their songwriting has certainly improved over the course of the last few albums. But it's again one that will be very, very interesting to see where they go from here. Right now, Jason Richardson is helping them on live dates. Is he going to become a full-time member? We don't know that right now for sure. But if it does happen, I'd be very interested to listen to that album. As for Victim of the New Disease, it's an 18 out of 30. It's definitely better than average, and it's definitely a good album. Not quite great, definitely not a classic, but still a very satisfactory listen. And considering I've not been able to say that about the last couple of offerings, I consider that a win-win. But I want to know what you think about Victim of the New Disease by All That Remains. Please let me know in the comments below. My name is CoverKillerNation, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Take care.